Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Chairman Powell, I'd like to discuss the continued efforts to unwind years and years of quantitative easing and what it's done to our Federal Reserve balance sheet. If you take a look at the size of the Federal Reserve's balance sheet since the 2008 financial crisis, we've seen an alarming increase from around $800 million to today's $8.3 trillion in assets. Back in 2018, you did start the work of winding down the balance sheet. You managed to offload roughly $700 billion assets between the beginning of your time as Federal Reserve Chair and August of 2019. The problem was, shortly after your efforts began, we had another major economic shock, the COVID-19 pandemic, that caused the Fed to once again return to quantitative easing as a form of economic relief. Pretty soon, the Federal Reserve's balance sheet had increased another $4 trillion in size. That's how we made it to the balance sheet level that we are at today. I understand you have started working to shed some of the Federal Reserve's balance sheet, and I appreciate the work. That being said, the scale involved here, to me, is startling. My concern, Chairman Powell, is that efforts to shed assets from the Fed's balance sheet have never been anywhere as quick as efforts to build it back up. Our economic cycle does go through recessions from time to time. It's not always boom, but some bust too. If we continue a pattern of rapidly building up the Federal Reserve's balance sheet in bad times and slowly shedding assets in good times, we're going to see the balance sheet grow significantly over time. Chairman Powell, is this a concern of yours? And to pair with that question, long-term, how can we avoid an environment where any effort to unwind the Federal Reserve's balance sheet is undone anytime there's an economic shock?
It is a concern, and that's why we are this time the balance sheet roll-off is much faster than it was back in the first episode. We also know more. We hadn't grown our balance sheet like that, and we hadn't shrunk it before. Now we have experience with that. So we are moving back down to a level that will be appropriate for our new framework. By the way, we won't go back to a framework where we were dealing with scarce reserves. We like the administrative rate framework that we're in now. But it is important that the balance sheet not just grow with every cycle, and I think I'm very conscious of that.
Chairman Powell, do you have an optimal Fed target for the size of what the balance sheet should look like? A number?
I'll give you the idea, and that is, you find the number, but the idea is that it's smaller than now. It's a place where reserves are abundant, and also have a little bit of a buffer on top of that so that we don't accidentally run into reserve scarcity. Demand for reserves can be volatile, and you don't want to find yourself, as we did a few years back, suddenly finding that reserves were scarce, even though we didn't see it coming, and we then had to put more reserves into the system at a time when we didn't want to be doing that. So I think you want to have a level where we have ample reserves plus a buffer, and that'll be a % of GDP that we get down to, and we're moving in that direction pretty smartly.
Chairman Powell, realistically, how quickly can the Federal Reserve unwind its balance sheet? What's the threshold beyond which an asset sell-off by the Federal Reserve would disrupt our markets?
So we don't sell assets. What we do is we allow them to mature and passively roll off, and that's what we're doing to the tune of about $1 trillion a year. And we're in the middle of that process. Now we will, it's an empirical question. You're going to find a level that is still ample, plus a bit of a buffer, and that's how we're thinking about it.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I would just reiterate my concern on this issue. I fear that having the Federal Reserve backstop so much of our economy through the holding of treasuries and mortgage-backed securities is not sustainable long-term. Thank you, Chairman. I yield back.